Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Bennett Borden, partner and chief data scientist at DLA Piper.
Thanks so much, Brittany, for having me.
Of course, I do want to talk about some news that broke just a few weeks ago. President Biden, at the end of October, signed an executive order putting some guardrails on AI. As a really expert in this space, what sticks out to you in this executive order?
Brittany, this is a really extensive marshaling of federal resources. It's one of the longest executive orders in the history of executive orders. And it really pulls together the resources of the executive branch in a way that we haven't seen really outside of wartime or pandemic or depression. It provides guidance to more than 20 federal departments on developing standards and best practices around the fair, ethical, and safe use of AI. It also calls on the independent regulatory agencies to use their regulatory authority to monitor and look for violations in their jurisdictional areas that are created by AI. So it's really quite an extensive executive order, but I think the most important thing is what it portends, that once these agencies develop these practices and standards, that we're going to see follow-on regulation and perhaps even legislation.
I know you're saying it's extensive, but do you think that it goes far enough in regulating AI, too far, or does it strike that perfect balance?
It's interesting because you can't actually create new law through executive orders. And so what you see the federal agencies doing is preparing for their rulemaking authority or to propose legislation. And so it crosses just about every part of our economy. Instructions to the Department of Commerce, especially the Federal Trade Commission, the EEOC, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and especially NIST, that drafted the AI risk management framework that came out in January. That is one of the most widely cited governance policy documents around how to manage the risks of AI. And it is instructed NIST to develop a follow-on companion piece to that around generative AI, but also coming up with standards. This is one of the biggest problems we have as legal practitioners who are out literally testing these AI systems. There's not an agreed upon standard. Like, what is it we're actually testing? What tests do we use? What measures come out of those? And is that measure a good thing or a bad thing? And so starting to develop this consensus around how do we test these AI and algorithmic systems for safety, accuracy, and fairness. With those standards in place, then I think you'll start to see movement into the regulated areas. And that's really where the rubber is going to meet the road, is when new requirements come out or new guidance on existing requirements start to come out in the coming year.
During this executive order signing, President Biden did call AI the most consequential technology of our time. Where are the challenges, do you think, when it comes to regulating this technology then?
I completely agree with that statement. We have often compared the advent of AI, and especially generative AI and these frontier models, these foundation models, compared them to the same effect that electricity had on our society. If you look at the second industrial revolution and companies that took advantage of the new motive power behind electricity, they completely changed not only how they conducted their businesses, but it changed the relationships between employees and employers. It introduced new kinds of situations in our society that we didn't have before. And so our legal frameworks had to adjust to that. That is what is going to happen now. This is a wondrously transformative and powerful technology. We are seeing advances in medicine and healthcare and education and the provision of public and private goods and services. But we're also seeing entirely new situations that we just haven't been able to do before as a society. And so you see legislatures and regulators around the globe wrestling with this question of How do we do this to take advantage of this transformative nature of it, but also control the inevitable disruption that's going to happen?
One of my colleagues, who's a tech reporter here at Forbes, was actually at the White House during this signing, and him and I had the opportunity to talk, and he said before this executive order tried to implement some guardrails, AI has largely been viewed like the Wild West. There's not that many, there's not that many guidance, regulations, things like that. So I am curious how the United States now stacks up globally. Are we ahead of the curve or behind when it comes to AI regulation?
I think we're kind of in the pack. What's really interesting about AI is that because it is such a new thing and there are big issues to wrestle with public policy, most of the governments around the world are wrestling with the same problem. And so you have the EU AI Act that has been in these trilogue negotiations for some time. We are wrestling with it. Canada, China, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America. And so the nice thing is everybody's kind of struggling with this at the same time. And so we're starting to see a little bit more consensus around how do you even think about governing and controlling these things. What I find interesting is that AI is regulated in the United States. If you look at the federal executive agencies and their state law equivalents, they regulate in certain areas, like the FTC for unfair and deceptive trade practices, the EEOC for employment, or the CFPB for personal finance. And they regulate in these areas regardless whether violations occur through the actions of a human or the actions of an AI system. And so we were fortunate to talk to some of the EEOC commissioners and CFPB and FTC recently, and they are very focused on what kinds of harm happen in their jurisdictional space through the use of AI. And so we will certainly see a great deal more regulatory action while the federal government wrestles with, do we need new rules or do we need new laws? And so the advice we give to our clients is, this is not all entirely new. Our clients function in their regulated space, and they know the rules and the guardrails around that. And there's ways to determine how their use of AI impacts that risk profile and how they control for that. And it's also a great opportunity for companies to engage with legislators and regulators. It's amazing how open these folks are to guidance and feedback, because these are new issues that we're wrestling with. And so the meetings at the White House, at the Senate and congressional hearings, even with the federal executive agencies, there's a wonderful opportunity to actually help shape the contours of new laws or regulations.
I'm curious how the industry has been receptive to regulation. Do they think that stifles innovation, or are they more receptive to it?
A little bit of both, and it depends on the industry. Industries that are very data centric, so think financial services, insurance, even housing and labor and employment, they're very data centric anyway. And so they just want to go about doing business and doing it in a fair, ethical, and safe way. And so guardrails are actually helpful. And so where we find some more challenges or resistance is when it's not clear how to do so. So if you think about, like, in the insurance industry that's been around for a couple hundred years, right? Actuarial tables and statistical analysis, that's what they do. But when you start asking about, you should look at these underwriting and claims handling algorithms for some kind of unintended bias, well, how? Like, what exactly are we measuring? And that makes them a little bit nervous. But that's where we have these wonderful opportunities to engage with the regulators to get into that discussion. There is a great deal of really stellar academic work going on in this area, and we've been fortunate to work with some of the leading academic institutions of the world on this, and trying to come up with, here are the different things I can look for, and here's the ways I can look for them, and here's the strengths and weaknesses, but then what do I do about it, right? Because sometimes if I find some unintended consequence, trying to tweak that to not cause other problems can be a challenge.
I do want to pivot now just a little bit and ask about the economic implications of this regulation on both businesses, big and small. What does that look like, A? And B, does it differ from larger businesses to smaller businesses?
So the overall economic impact should be quite good. One, because of AI generally. If you think about what AI does, it gives us a clearer insight into whatever we're looking at, whether it's anything from what ad you click on, what you'll enjoy in your streaming recommendations, or even things like underwriting for consumer finance or insurance. Getting better insight into those characteristics should make the markets more efficient, right? Pure Adam Smith says that the better information you have about a market, the more efficient it gets. The challenge will come with companies that try too much to defend the way they have been successful in the past. If you look at the list of the 100 companies before the Second Industrial Revolution that were the most successful companies, and then look at the 100 afterwards, there's only 3 or 4 companies that are on both of those lists. And that's because companies have been successful in doing what they've done for some time. This is an entirely new technology that can truly like jet start what they do. But companies that are too defensive of how they have been successful in the past may lose this opportunity. And frankly, that's where I think more of the economic turmoil might come from.
Then do you think that companies really need to lean into AI?
I do. And doing so safely. Like, it's really quite interesting. We're working with some of the biggest companies around the planet and all these different industries, and everybody is trying to figure out, how do we take advantage of this? And at times, they're puzzled. They're like, well, how do I do this? And what we try to say is, you know how to do this, right? Every company does stuff, whatever stuff they do, and they do it in a series of steps. Some of those steps are optimizable by AI, and some of those are quintessentially human tasks. And so what we tell our clients is, think Iron Man, not Terminator, right? So it's not like AI is, you're just going to plug it in and it's going to take over somebody's job. There may be a few jobs that are entirely overtaken by AI, but the reality is that it steps within jobs. And so it's the marrying of human acumen and AI technology that can really unlock the potential of what AI can do.
I think viewers listening to you right now will feel a sense of relief, because ever since AI and ChatGPT really came into the lexicon about a year ago, the first question that comes to people's mind is AI going to take over the world? Specifically, will it take over my job? And Bennett, you're the expert here. What do you think is missing from the national conversation then when it comes to AI and AI regulation?
It is understanding what it can do. If you think AI, especially generative AI, at this point, it can identify, collect, summarize, and a little bit of baby analysis on data. And so tasks in your work stream, when you do your stuff, that rely on those skills, those should be done by AI. They will always be better, and they will continue to get better. It's the next steps that are human. So things like inference, judgment, compassion, persuasion, the human element of interacting with customers or employees or whomever. And so really thinking about how we go about doing what we do, and how can I bring AI in to bolster and augment and extend the acumen of my employees, that's the thinking to take. On the regulatory side, it is just going to be some time, maybe 3 years or more, before we have new law or new rules, because it just takes time for those things to happen. There is AI legislation that's been proposed in both the House and the Senate. As recently as last week, the AI Research, Innovation, and Accountability Act that was proposed by 6 bipartisan senators from the Department of Commerce. But imagine how is that going to pass anytime before the election? And even the executive order that calls on federal agencies to propose new rules, the rulemaking process simply takes a long time. Proposed rules, public comment, hearings, passage, and then they have to go into effect. So the reality is that we are going to remain in an unsettled space for at least 3 years. But we have to be able to move forward. And so what we tell our clients is fall back to kind of a reasonableness standard. If you're introducing AI into your workflow, it's thinking about how does that change my risk profile and how am I reasonably mitigating those risks? That will keep you abreast of any of this AI regulation worldwide that's happening, and you can kind of pivot and fine tune as those regulations and laws come into effect. But you can also use that kind of reasonableness position to defend yourself in court or defend yourself in the public forum. And so what we always keep trying to tell our clients is, you got this. You can do this. You're used to thinking about risk. Now the thing to think is, how does my risk profile change by using AI?
Something that I can compare this time to, it feels like it's almost like at the early dawn of the social media age when Congress and the entire country didn't know how to exactly regulate that, but then laws did eventually catch up. And I am curious, what is on your radar right now? I know you said the next 3 years are an unsettled period, but what do you think the future of AI looks like? And I know that is just an incredible question, but what does that look like to you?
So I think the first thing we're going to see is that state and federal agencies and their global equivalents are going to start enforcing in existing regulatory areas. And so things like employment discrimination or fairness, the fair and deceptive trade practices, underwriting for insurance and consumer finance, all those regulations are existing today. And so what you're going to see is a push toward, if you're using AI, you must test and monitor those systems for unintended consequences. This is where every agency I have talked to, that's what they're talking about. I do think we're going to see new rules and laws because there are situations that we just didn't deal with before. One of which is like the world of intellectual property. One of the things the executive order does is instructs the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office and the Copyright Office to look at guidance for AI-created works or AI-augmented patents. Right now, it is not at all clear whether AI-generated works can be copyrighted. Right now, the Copyright Office has said, if it is created solely by AI, it cannot be copyrighted. But if you take the generated content and add creative human creativity to it, that can be copyrighted. On the patent side, AI created code or products cannot be patented. But again, when there's a human involved in human creativity, it starts to change that. So part of the instructions to these IP regulators is develop new guidance and then propose new rules or legislation that we need to pass to cover that. So I think in the meantime, these edge cases are going to be pushed into the courts. If you look at like the copyright cases for like with Sarah Silverman and Stephen King, right? This idea of you scraped my stuff and you made $1 billion product and I didn't get anything out of it and I'm mad about it. Well, that's a unique legal claim. And so I think we're going to see a lot of court action while the regulators and legislators begin to catch up.
Bennett, I really appreciate your insights. I appreciate the conversation as it continues to develop because we are in that unsettled time, as you said. I hope you come back in and break it on down for us. Bennett Borden, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Brittany. Wonderful to be here.